Yep, there we go. We'll get the recording going. And then we are streaming to Facebook as well. So I'm going to start admitting some people here. Let's go, team.
Here we go.
Hello, those that are joining us. Thanks for being here. Right at 12, feel free to leave your camera off if you'd like. We understand it's lunchtime, but also hang out with us. We're going to go ahead and give it a couple of minutes as people start to join. If you have your lunch, get comfortable. We'll go ahead and get started. We don't plan on taking the full hour, so go ahead and hang out with us. Hopefully we'll get you some time to enjoy your lunch break, but we are excited to have you here. Hello, all that have already joined us. I've put a note in the chat, but we're going to give it a few minutes to let people grab their lunch, get settled in, and then we will get started at about 12:05. But feel free to leave your camera off if you would like, or you can hang out with us. Please feel free to utilize the chat for any questions, comments, things like that. Our HEAL team will be monitoring that. And we're excited you're here to join us for our first webinar. So yeah, thank you all for being here. Shannon, can you hear me any better? Can everyone hear me okay?
I can hear you, Carmen.
Oh, great. Hi, Craig. And Shannon, if you're still having trouble with sound, I'll also drop this in the chat. We will be recording and then we'll be sending it out to everyone as well. So feel free to drop your email and we'll make sure we send it to you as well. Oh, Hannah, I'm glad that there's multiple people in the office. That makes that easy. We'll give it a little bit of time, see if Shannon can sit down. Oh, great. Okay, yay, Shannon. I'm glad it's working. And yeah, we will definitely be sending out a recording as well. We are so excited to have everyone here. It looks like a few more people are joining us. I'm so excited. This is our first webinar in a bit. So we're excited to see all of you here. Yay! And yeah, feel free to drop in the chat, hang out with us. We work with a few of you. We're excited that you're here and want to get caught up on what we're doing. So if you haven't already, grab some lunch, make yourself comfortable. And thank you so much for joining me during your lunch hour today. If you don't know me, I'm Carmen ValDez. I'm a policy associate for HEAL Utah, where I focus on HEAL's toxic and radioactive waste campaigns. If you'd like to, feel free to drop in the chat where you're calling in from and what you're enjoying for lunch, if you are enjoying anything. So I'm calling in from the HEAL office in Salt Lake City. You can see our amazing mural behind us. But also I just grabbed, I was at a meeting at La Barba in Salt Lake City at the Maven district and had an excellent black bean and potato taco with my coffee for my brunch time. It was excellent. So feel free to drop in the chat where you're at, where you're having lunch. But let's go ahead and get started. So the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah, or HEAL Utah's legacy, is rooted in combating toxic and radioactive exposures and the grassroots effort to combat those threats. HEAL was first formed as the Families Against Incinerator Risk, fighting against the Tooele Army Depot's incineration of chemical weapons in their facility near communities in Tooele in 1990. Oh, let me make the screen work. Yay, okay. So since then, and for the last 25 years, we have been working to protect communities from exposure to radioactive and toxic hazards in our state. This has included fighting and stopping waste from being imported in for long-term disposal in Utah and the generation of waste from multiple industries. We have also been supporting the Utahns who were exposed to radioactive fallout during nuclear weapons testing at the Nevada testing grounds and helping them to fight for continued recognition and compensation for those harms. And for those of you who don't know, this picture was taken outside of the Moab uranium tailings pile that's being cleaned up, and that's right as you're entering Moab. So you might recognize that location there, and that's looking into Moab from that location. So today we are going to talk about Utah's past, present, and future when it comes to radioactive and toxic threats we face. We will talk about the uranium industry, radioactive waste, radon in our homes, and also provide an update on how you can support the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for Utahns. We'll have some time for questions at the end, but feel free to add anything into the chat and our team will get to them during the meeting, but also at the end when we start taking some questions. So you may be asking, why does HEAL Utah do this work? While there are many toxic materials that we are exposed to on a daily basis, HEAL Utah is particularly concerned with human exposure to radioactive materials like uranium from activities from nuclear weapons manufacturing, testing, and nuclear energy production that have directly affected our state in the past and present and likely in our future. In addition, other toxic materials that affect environmental health here in Utah include radioactive materials dumped or disposed of in our state, radon in our homes, and other toxic chemicals like ethylene oxide released through industrial processes. So why should we be concerned about radioactive and toxic exposures in Utah? Well, acute exposure to high levels of radioactivity or industrial chemicals can produce immediate symptoms like nausea, burns, breathing impairments, and even mortality. And many of these materials persist at harmful levels in our environment for decades and centuries in some cases. This increases the lifetime risk of cancers, heart and kidney problems, and other diseases. Because these toxic materials persist in our environment for long periods of time, the negative impacts on human health are often exacerbated through multiple pathways of exposure, including inhalation, ingestion directly or indirectly through our food and water, and direct skin contact. Exposure to radioactivity and other toxins can lead to serious health problems, most notably cancer, lung damage, kidney impairments, and birth defects. Even after decades of decay, just a few minutes of unshielded exposure to some forms of radioactive and toxic waste can deliver lethal doses of contaminants. And depending on the dose of radiation and the person, right, ranging from adults, adult males, females, children, pregnant women, the effects on the human body range. The smallest doses of radiation exposure can cause mild nausea and vomiting, fatigue that can last up to 4 weeks, and greater susceptibility to infections and illnesses. Mild radiation sickness from more exposure can cause hair loss, destruction of all or part of the thyroid gland, destruction of cells, including our blood cells, gastrointestinal cells, our reproductive cells, and direct damage to our DNA in any of the surviving cells. Increased doses of radiation can lead to serious radiation sickness, bone marrow and intestinal harm, possible heart failure, and permanent reproductive organ damage. And in the worst cases, death can occur within days. So should Utah be concerned? Yes. Utah is currently ranked 5th and highest in the nation for total toxic releases per square mile. And Utah has multiple pathways of contamination. This includes a total of 181.8 million pounds of material disposed and released in 2022. Contamination of our air, land, and water, whether it's through mining, dumping of waste, nuclear testing, or other releases, harms plants and animals and builds up in our food chain. We have seen Utah steadily move up in this national ranking as other states tighten regulations around toxic releases and clean up their industries. And this image here, you can see where all these contaminations exist or where facilities have released some sort of contamination from that 2022 report through the EPA. And as you can see, there's quite a few along the Wasatch Front and all throughout our state. So these multiple pathways of exposure increase our overall health risks to our communities as we inhale, ingest, and come in direct contact with these materials. Heal Utah works on these issues in part because of the environmental injustices related to radioactive and toxic exposures. Many of these contaminated sites like mines, mills, and waste dumps were historically near communities that lacked political and economic power to oppose them, including, in many cases, our communities of color and Indigenous communities. Communities that live near contaminated sites are often socially and economically disadvantaged and cope with generations of exposure and illnesses. This creates a cycle of burdens linked to financial and health problems. A current today, Utah example of an overburdened community fighting against radioactive contamination is the Ute Mountain Ute White Mesa community fighting against the privately owned White Mesa Mill. We'll be talking about that more in our next section. In addition, communities may also lack the resources needed to obtain remediation necessary to protect their families from continued exposure. The land, air, water, plants, and wildlife are all at risk of contamination, along with their homes, community centers, and outdoor spaces. All this means that a lifetime of exposure to radioactive and toxic contaminations can be a reality for communities spanning generations. In this image here, you can see there's multiple pathways in which a person can experience radiation and toxic exposures. So Heal Utah is advocating for a safer future for all Utahns. We are advocating for clear and enforceable legislation for mining and industry practices that prioritize public health and environment and public welfare. And we encourage a mandate of robust community engagement with impacted communities before, during, and after potential contaminations. Before we can move forward with our energy future and our future as a whole, we must face and remediate the past harms that have disproportionately been borne by our vulnerable communities. This includes expanding and extending the Radioactive Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, cleaning up abandoned mines and sources of toxic pollution, and putting safeguards in place to ensure that these violations of human rights never happen again. So here's a quick update on our work. Utah's uranium industry. There are hundreds of abandoned mines throughout the Western United States, with the densest concentration located in southeastern Utah and throughout the Southwest. A legacy of the boom and bust cycles common in the uranium industry. Each of these mines creates environmental hazards to public health through the contamination of groundwater, blowing contaminated dust, and physical instability of materials. The federal government has been slow to remediate these mine sites, and the nuclear fuel and weapons industries are eyeing this area once again for the resumption of uranium production in the United States. We have already seen the reopening of mines along the south rim of the Grand Canyon, in the La Salle Mountains near Moab, and there's interest in reopening mines near Bears Ears National Monument. This map is from Heal Utah's maps page. Each of these you can see are abandoned uranium mines, which are the tiny little circles, Superfund sites, which are the triangles, and then the large red dots are low-level waste disposal and uranium mill facilities. So Salt Lake's right up in here. Here's our southeastern communities that are heavily overburdened. So as mentioned, those uranium mines and the uranium industry is gearing to pick its pace back up. The materials extracted from these mines will be sent to San Juan County in southeastern Utah to the White Mesa Mill. The White Mesa Mill is currently the only licensed uranium mill in the United States and is located near Blanding, Utah, and on the doorstep of the Ute Mountain Ute White Mesa Community Reservation. A uranium mill is where small amounts of uranium and large amounts of ore, which are the rocks and dirt and everything like that, the uranium is extracted from the ore from a mine and is separated from the rest of the material and made into yellow cake, which is then shipped off and enriched in centrifuges to make uranium fuel and weapons. The ongoing operation of this business creates risks of contaminated groundwater, highway spills of radioactive material, and airborne dissemination of radioactive isotopes throughout the entire process. Heal Utah supports the Ute Mountain Ute White Mesa Tribe and other community members to advocate for limiting the waste that is allowed into the White Mesa Mill, as well as strengthening regulation of the site for production of uranium. Heal is continuing its advocacy work with the EPA and the Utah Division of Waste Management and Radiation Control, voicing our concerns and expressing support for better and more accountable monitoring and mitigation for uranium mills, as called for by the White Mesa community. We also monitor any new proposed projects related to uranium mining, milling, transporting, processing, and storage. Workers on site of uranium mines and mills and the transporters have a higher risk of exposure, but nearby communities are also at risk for exposure through downwind effects and contamination of land and water sources for centuries to come. So you can see our leaders from White Mesa Concerned Community in the top left image. On the bottom left, you can see an image of the White Mesa Mill, which you can also find if you look on Google Maps. You can zoom in and see it. And then on the right is an image that advocates took at some abandoned uranium mines in the La Salle Mountains. And you can see a rancher's free-range goat eating contaminated plants right next to a uranium shaft right there. So let's talk about waste. Waste from many industries ends up being radioactive or toxic and needs proper disposal. Much of the waste from mining, milling, and processing of uranium, as well as from the nuclear energy industry and nuclear weapons development of uranium, is radioactive and needs to be disposed of properly. And we are talking everything from the tailings or what's left behind from the ore once it gets broken down to the contaminated towels from cleanups that need to be done. All of this needs to be disposed of as radioactive or hazardous waste. That waste remains radioactive for decades or even centuries. Here in Utah, there is one company that is making profits from bringing waste into Utah's West Desert. And here you can see the 4 Nuclear Regulatory Commission locations of low-level waste disposal. And Clive is Energy Solutions, and that is just west of Salt Lake City on your way to Wendover. And that cute little image right there is the Great Salt Lake, and it looks a little bigger than it is now. So let's continue talking about waste. Energy Solutions is one of the largest nuclear waste processing companies in the world. They maintain a radioactive waste landfill in Tooele County, just west of the highly populated Wasatch Front and the endangered Great Salt Lake. Energy Solutions frequently requests variances on regulations and lobbies for changes to state laws in our state legislature in order to expand the scope of what they can bring in and store in their waste pits in Utah's desert. As a note, I did see they're requesting variants related to uranium processing at the DIMRIC meeting this afternoon, so stay tuned. HEAL constantly monitors and advocates against loosening of regulations, as these variances and changing laws can increase environmental and public health threats in Utah. Most recently, we have been working to counter federal rulemaking process that would loosen restrictions around low-level waste, potentially allowing the importation of hotter waste to come into Utah to be transported across the state and disposed of in the West Desert. So in the image on your right, you can see the Energy Solutions facility from the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. But this left image is the HEAL office to the Energy Solutions location. So when this waste comes into the state, it has to be transported via truck or train, and it's going through our communities. And as you can see, it's on your way to Wendover. It's just south of the Great Salt Lake. And it's very much a part of Utah's West Desert. So outside of radioactive toxic waste and uranium also creates uranium tailings piles, waste sites, and radioactive waste continues to pose a threat to human health. But here in Utah, we have an even more pervasive threat that's not in just the West Desert, but also in Salt Lake City and throughout pretty much all of Utah and in our homes as well. We need to talk about radon. Radon is a cancer-causing radioactive gas that poses a significant threat to public health, particularly in Utah, where 1/3 of our homes have dangerous levels of radon. Nationally, radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. Radon is formed when uranium or radium breaks down in rocks and soil and groundwater and easily seeps into buildings through cracks, holes, and porous foundation materials, especially in our basements. This often goes unnoticed due to the fact that you cannot taste, smell, or see radon. Once radon is inside a building, it becomes trapped and it accumulates to dangerous levels. Many homeowners or renters in Utah may be aware of the invisible danger lurking within their homes. And while regulations exist to address radon, the need for stricter testing requirements and a heightened awareness campaign is evident and necessary. Without more proactive measures, the preventable threat of radon exposures continues to endanger the health and well-being of communities across Utah. Research has shown that the communities listed on this slide are facing some of the highest levels of radon contamination, although it could be said that all of Utah faces one of the highest risks of radiation or radon exposure in the nation. HEAL Utah is working with partners towards effective state policy actions in collaborations with existing programs, government agencies, and local research working groups, including the Utah Radon Lab and the University of Utah. Our efforts encompass advocating for robust state policies that prioritize radon testing with statewide standards and mitigation measures in homes and public buildings like our schools. Utah currently lacks certification requirements for radon testing specialists in an even and cohesive manner. We are working to pass legislation that establishes standards that will benefit residents, radon testing and mitigation companies, and data researchers. These standards will help create a safe baseline for radiation mitigation in our future. Additionally, we advocate for policies that mandate radon testing standards and radon testing during real estate transactions. We encourage radon-resistant new construction and encourage providing financial assistance for radon mitigation to ensure that our in existing structures so that families are not left with the choice of living in radon contamination or paying high costs for remediation. It's going to be critical to collaborate with the public health and housing agencies, local businesses, community members, and our decision makers to develop and implement these solutions effectively. If you have your phone, these 2 QR codes will take you to the Utah Radon Lab, as well as to the Utah Department of Environmental Quality, who provides resources for radon testing. So I just want to re-emphasize HEAL's work that we have done and recenter ourselves, because a lot of that can feel a little scary, but I want to give you hope because this is something that HEAL is working on and we will continue to work on. HEAL or Utah specifically has a connection to radioactive and toxic threats to our communities. The boom and bust cycle of the uranium industry, the dumping of radioactive waste in our deserts, and radon in our homes are constant threats to both urban and rural communities here in Utah. There's one more radioactive threat that we are here to talk about today, and that started with many of our grandparents' generations, but still affects us today, and that's nuclear weapons testing and the subsequent Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which is also celebrating 25 years, much like HEAL. Oh man, okay, so let's talk about nuclear weapons testing in the Southwest. The West and Utah in particular has a long legacy of nuclear weapons testing and uranium mining, which has harmed many communities and workers throughout our state. Utah's history is tightly linked to nuclear weapons testing. Following the first nuclear weapons test in New Mexico, now made famous by the movie Oppenheimer, if you all have seen it, the Southwest became a nuclear wasteland. At the Nevada testing grounds just west of St. George, over 928 atmospheric nuclear weapons were detonated. When a nuclear weapon detonates, it releases a massive amount of energy in the form of heat and radiation that then creates radioactive fallout that can span across large areas. The nuclear fallout released into the atmosphere is then carried by winds across Utah and eventually the rest of the world. Nuclear fallout can cause severe harm to the human body, including radiation sickness that we talked about earlier, increased cancer risk we talked about earlier, genetic mutations, and damage to our organs and tissues. This potentially leading to long-term health complications or death. Utah was next door to nuclear weapons test after test from January 1951 to September 1992. So here is the Nevada test site per Google. And if you try to map yourself to that location, it will not pull it up. So don't try it, or you can, and let me know if you're able to find it. But as you can see, St. George, right across the way, here's Cedar City, Moab's cut off over here. And here we are in Salt Lake City. Here is an image of one of the nuclear weapons testing called DOG. And you can see what it looks like and how everyone, even though radiation can cause severe harms, it was encouraged to take a look because this was making of history. But now we have seen, and with the RECA expansion or RECA program, on-site workers developed cancers and are part of the RECA program. So what is RECA? In 1990, as a response to many communities falling ill and contracting cancers linked to exposure to radioactive nuclear fallout, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, was created. This legislation was championed by Utah's own local advocates, including many in Washington County, and our own Senator Orrin Hatch, as a means to acknowledge the harms resulting from federal nuclear weapons testing done at the Nevada testing grounds, and to acknowledge those communities living downwind who are unknowingly exposed to radioactive nuclear fallout. RECA provides monetary compensation to individuals who contracted cancer or other diseases that can be linked to their exposure to radiation from atmospheric nuclear testing or from the mining, milling, and transportation of uranium ore during the Cold War. The types of illnesses covered include cancers of the thyroid, breast, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, pancreas, urinary bladder, brain, colon, ovary, bone, liver, except for a few specific liver diseases, lung, and several other specific cancers. Since its creation, RECA has been a lifeline for many individuals and families in Utah, receiving a one-time lump financial compensation as a downwinder or a uranium worker. As you can see here, a downwinder are these counties in blue, which is in green because that's that overlap, and yellow is the uranium worker states. And this little image here shows the Nevada testing site. Downwinders mean they lived downwind of the nuclear testing and experienced radioactive nuclear fallout from the wind and from the atmospheric blowing. So as of April 2023, 7,754 awarded RECA claims have been given to individuals in Utah, putting Utah as the second highest awarded state. Unfortunately, RECA is an imperfect tool and sets very specific windows for eligibility and excludes many communities in Utah around the nation and on the Pacific Rim who have suffered as a consequence of federal nuclear testing. In addition, it has a limited window of dates and was originally planned to expire in 2000, which has required several extensions since then. Recently, in 2022, we achieved a 2-year extension of the program through congressional action. That means that RECA is now set to expire on June 7th, 2024. So if you're keeping track of the date today, that means that RECA is set to expire a month from today, or yesterday rather, and so many others exposed to nuclear fallout need your advocacy. There are so many stories of communities and families being affected by nuclear fallout. The University of Utah Marriott Library's Downwinders of the Utah Archive has compiled many stories of victims in a publicly accessible resource. This collection includes stories in videos and transcripts and written and letters. It includes research, timelines, and information about the harms of radiation exposure and is a vital piece of Utah's legacy. And many more Utahns could be part of this collection than what currently exists. You can actually find a complete list of the Nevada test site nuclear detonations on that site, resources on radiation exposure, and even the Chip Ward papers consisting of correspondence and other materials related to the incineration of chemical weapons and the military's involvement. So a peek into Utah's history, into Heels Start as Fair. Just want to flag that Chip's going to be part of our 25th anniversary spring breakfast, which I'll bring up at the end. But this is an incredible resource and really goes to show how deep Utah's history is related to the nuclear weapons and uranium industry and how it has harmed people in the past. And there's still advocates that are encouraging support and action today. This QR code, if you're using your phone, will take you to the Downwinders of Utah Archive. It's an incredible tool and resource. And this image here gives you a better description of the communities covered as downwinders here in Utah. As you can see, it pretty much goes across the southern part of Utah. But we're going to get to why we think that needs to be expanded a little bit more right now. Great. So Heal Utah, along with the National RECA Working Group, has been advocating for RECA's extension and expansion for over a decade. Recently, the US Senate passed legislation to not only extend the program for another 6 years, but to also expand the coverage of downwinder states, including expanding Utah's current downwinder population. This expansion would expand the eligible areas to include all of Utah as downwinders. Thanks to recent and continued research, as you can see from this map from researchers in the last year on the right-hand side, there is ample evidence that all of Utah, including Salt Lake County, Summit County, and Cache County, experience radioactive nuclear fallout from nuclear weapons tested across the border in Nevada. The proposed expansion bill that has passed the Senate would also increase the one-time financial compensation to allocate for increasing medical costs associated with the illnesses and cancers caused by radioactive nuclear fallout. That one-time lump compensation in the current program is a one-time lump compensation of $50,000 as a downwinder. I don't know if many of you are watching the medical industry and how much it costs to even go to the doctors to get cancer treatments. But there needs to be an expansion of what is available to people, because now they're being left with the choices of financial opportunities or losing their homes in order to pay for their healthcare. This map on the right, I do want to flag, comes from some research by Princeton University that was in a New York Times article. And you can see the estimated deposition density of fission products from atmospheric nuclear testing. So down here, you can see the Trinity test, which is pretty deep purple. But this really deep purple right here, that's the Nevada testing site. As you can see, Utah was in direct line of all of this radioactive fallout. There's also been research to see, and it's included in this awesome research article, that the radiation went all the way up into Canada. And we now know, thanks to incredible researchers who continue to do this work, that radiation can continue traveling and can actually come back all the way around the world in about a week or so. So we just want to emphasize how purple Utah is and how it did not stop at the arbitrarily drawn line of just the Southwest, right? You can see that all of Utah was exposed to radioactive fallout. So now that I've emphasized that, it should be worth noting that the legislation led by Senator Hawley that was passed in the Senate, both of Utah's senators voted against this important piece of legislation and instead presented their own meager 2-year extension bill of the current program. Their justification was that the expansion wouldn't benefit anyone in Utah. Keel, downwinders, and uranium workers, researchers, and dozens of community advocates across the nation say otherwise. As I mentioned, we are officially 1 month away from the expiration of RECA. Now, Utah's downwinders urgently need you to take action. Go to HEAL's Action Alert, linked in the chat, as well as use your QR code here, and send a message to your House members to urge them to vote yes for Senate Bill 3853 for RECA's extension and expansion. Ask them to continue Utah's legacy of supporting downwind and uranium communities. We also ask that if you or someone you know is a downwinder or possibly a downwinder, right, based on those maps of radiation exposure, you can also find a link on our Action Alert page to submit your story for us to share with our congressional delegation, because they think it's not going to benefit anyone and we want to show them otherwise. Your story can further our advocacy efforts and demonstrate to our decision makers that an expansion and extension of RECA is still necessary in Utah. So I'll give that a little bit longer and we'll make sure we drop that in the chat for you all as well. And I also want to share these resources. If you'd like more information on how to apply as a downwinder or uranium worker, if you want to share this with people you might know, because we get calls all the time, you can find more details on the program through the Department of Justice website on RECA. Contact the Radiation Exposure Screening and Education Program, which is the bottom one here, or Intermountain Health's Cancer Clinic, where you can actually find RECA specialists to help you in the process of an application. It is important to note that this process may take some time and patience, and you must have original documentation proving that you are located in one of those areas, and your patience is necessary. You should also note that if RECA is not extended or expanded, your application must be postmarked by June 10th. Seeking compensation for the harm caused by radiation exposure is worth the effort. And if you have more questions, you can contact Intermountain Health's RECA counselors directly. We have talked with the awesome counselors there. They do presentations around the state. And they've helped a lot of people submit their applications because this is a lengthy process, but we want to try and support you as much as we can. So please use the QR codes or ask in the chat and we can send those links directly to you. That was a lot of information. Thank you for being with us today. I want to leave some time for questions, so please raise your hand or drop your questions in the chat. Thank you so much. I'm seeing links. Oh, Craig, you're excellent. Thank you. I'm glad to see everyone eating some food too. Yay, yay, yay. Sorry, I just barely checked my chat. Any questions, feel free to raise your hand or go ahead and start asking. Craig, hi, Craig.
Hey, Carmen. Yeah, you were talking about hazardous materials along with nuclear materials, energy solutions as well as energy fuels, two different companies. The reason I put that one link in there was Union Pacific lists that hazardous materials is the second largest volume coming into Utah, and it's the third largest one going out. And I've never been able to figure out, who's doing that, what it is, where it's going. But I just thought that's an official document from Union Pacific. And for a state that's really more a service economy, it's kind of amazing apparently the quantity of hazardous materials, to your point, that Utah is dealing with.
And Union Pacific and all of these companies keep it on the down low, right? Because it could be a threat. It can harm communities. So they want to keep it really on the down low. Craig, I'm going to ask you to email me those because those would be excellent to share. And I so appreciate you bringing that up because we bring in a lot of waste and we have workers who are working on dealing with that waste, right? So they're being exposed to these things. So, and they're going through our communities. That's something that we need to emphasize to people is it doesn't just appear at these waste disposal sites, right? Like it has to be transported across the nation. Utah Energy Fuels has accepted waste from as far away as Japan. So there's international waste coming all the way here. And really to emphasize radioactive waste and hazardous waste does not go away. It stays radioactive and hazardous for centuries, essentially, if not 10,000 years, I think at this point. So we're dealing with really long-term dumping in our state and accumulations, mixtures, things like that. It's hard. Thanks for flagging that, Craig. I appreciate you always. Anyone else have some questions? Okay, as always, I know this was probably a little overwhelming, a little doom and gloom, but feel free to reach out to HEAL to continue working on these issues, to find ways to be engaged, and please contact your House delegation. They are currently supporting the 2-year extension instead of the expansion and extension, which means we're just going to keep fighting this, and they're just pushing the can down the line. So continue to reach out to them. Feel free to share that action alert with anyone that you may know across the nation, because we made sure that it's open to all of the House members to ensure that we're getting lots of people in attendance. So thank you all for your advocacy and for joining us today. This is the first of a few lunchtime program updates HEAL is going to be hosting over the next few months. So thanks for joining us for our first one. Join us in July for a virtual discussion on air quality in Utah. And if you haven't already, make sure to take action for Utah's downwinders and uranium workers. And if you didn't get a chance to join us at the screening of Downwind this past January, and you happen to be in Washington County this Saturday, there is another free film screening on May 11th. And we will also be hosting some film screenings this summer related to this issue. So be on the lookout for that. And then if you are in Salt Lake City on May 17th, that is next Friday, join us for our spring fundraiser. A registration link will be dropped in the chat. You can see that QR code. Chip Ward, one of our founders, and also his papers were included in the Utah Downwinders archive, is going to be our guest speaker. And we're going to have yummy brunch food and have a chance to hang out with us. So please hang out with us and reach out anytime with any other questions. Thank you all so much for being here. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop in the chat and please reach out anytime.
I'm sorry for jumping in, but just dropped down a article about Cox joining on supporting for this expansion. So we're seeing some great movement and it's really exciting to see this continue moving forward.
Thank you, Mesa. Yeah, I think we got that notice this morning that Cox is pushing for it. So we're we're hoping that our national delegation gets the hint that they need to do a little bit more than a 2-year extension. So thanks all. I hope you have a great rest of your day. And thanks for joining us. Bye.